This book was generated using Speakter's AI voices. You can create human-like voiceovers in over 50 languages.
Alice sat by the riverbank, her boredom growing with each passing moment. Her sister's book, devoid of pictures or conversations, failed to capture her interest on this lazy afternoon. The warm sun dappled through the leaves, casting dancing shadows on the grass. But even nature's beauty couldn't dispel Alice's restlessness. She sighed, her fingers idly plucking at blades of grass, the soft rustling a counterpoint to the gentle burble of the river. Suddenly, a flash of white caught her eye. Alice blinked, rubbing her eyes as if to clear away a mirage. There, not 10 feet away, stood a white rabbit. But this was no ordinary rabbit. It had pink eyes that darted nervously, and more incredibly, it wore a waistcoat complete with a pocket watch. The sight was so unexpected, so utterly bizarre, that Alice felt her heart skip a beat. "Oh my whiskers, I'm late, I'm late," the rabbit muttered, his voice high-pitched and frantic. The words hung in the air, as impossible as the creature that had uttered them. Curiosity sparked within Alice, chasing away her lethargy like a gust of wind scattering autumn leaves. Without a second thought, she scrambled to her feet and dashed after the peculiar creature. The rabbit bounded away, surprisingly quick for its portly frame. Alice's heart raced with excitement as she followed, her dress snagging on brambles, her hair coming loose from its neat bow. The world around her blurred into a green and brown smear as she focused solely on the retreating white form ahead. Just as she thought she might lose sight of her quarry, Alice spotted the rabbit disappearing down a large hole beneath a hedge. She skidded to a stop at the edge, peering into the darkness below. The hole seemed to go on forever, like a tunnel to the center of the earth. A cool breeze wafted up from its depths, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and something else. Something Alice couldn't quite place, but which smelled of adventure. Well, Alice thought, her chest heaving from the chase, I've come this far. And with that, she took a deep breath, her heart pounding a wild rhythm against her ribs, and plunged into the unknown. The fall was unlike anything Alice had ever experienced. Time seemed to stretch and warp as she tumbled through the darkness. The walls of the tunnel were lined with cupboards and bookshelves, maps and pictures. As she fell past them, Alice caught glimpses of jam jars and teacups, clocks that ticked backwards, and mirrors that showed impossible reflections. Her stomach lurched with each twist and turn, a mix of fear and exhilaration coursing through her veins. Just when Alice thought the fall would never end, she landed with a soft thump on a pile of leaves and twigs. Dazed but unharmed, she found herself in a long, low hall, lit by a row of lamps hanging from the ceiling. The hall stretched out before her, lined with doors of all shapes and sizes. The air here was different, still and heavy with the weight of countless secrets. Alice's curiosity, far from sated, only grew. She tried each door in turn, but found them all locked. Frustration began to creep in, a tightness in her chest that threatened to overwhelm her sense of wonder. But then she spotted a small glass table, its surface gleaming in the soft lamplight. Atop it sat a tiny golden key, glinting like a beacon of hope. With trembling fingers, Alice snatched up the key and tried it in each lock. None fit until she pulled back a curtain to reveal a door no larger than a mouse hole. To her amazement, the key slid in perfectly, the lock turning with a satisfying click. As the door swung open, Alice gasped. Beyond lay the most beautiful garden she had ever seen. Flowers of every color imaginable swayed in a gentle breeze, their perfume wafting through the tiny opening. Fountains sparkled in the sunlight, and butterflies danced from bloom to bloom. It was a vision of paradise, tantalizingly close yet impossibly out of reach. Alice's heart sank as she realized her predicament. If only I were small enough to fit through, she lamented, eyeing the minuscule doorway. Her fingers traced the outline of the door, feeling the smooth wood and cool metal of the hinges, a stark contrast to the vastness of her current form. Returning to the glass table, Alice noticed something she had overlooked before, a small bottle with a paper label that read, "Drink me," in elegant script. She hesitated, remembering her mother's warnings about drinking strange concoctions. But the allure of the garden and the mystery of her situation overrode her caution. The bottle felt cool in her hand, the glass smooth against her skin. Well, Alice reasoned, her voice echoing slightly in the empty hall. "If it does something bad, I'll know not to do it again." And with that, she took a sip. The effect was immediate and astonishing. Alice felt herself shrinking, the world around her growing larger by the second. Her dress billowed around her like a tent as she dwindled to just 10 inches tall. The sensation was dizzying, like being on a fairground ride that had suddenly gone out of control. Elated by her new size, Alice rushed to the little door. Her joy turned to dismay as she realized she had left the golden key on the table, now impossibly out of reach. The beautiful garden, so close she could almost smell the flowers, might as well have been on the moon. Tears of frustration welled in Alice's eyes as she slumped against the table leg. It was then that she noticed a small glass box beneath the table. Inside was a cake iced with the words, "Eat me," in currants. The sight of it made her stomach growl, reminding her that she hadn't eaten since breakfast. Hope fluttered in Alice's chest. "If drinking made me shrink," she reasoned, her voice tiny in the vast hall, "perhaps eating will make me grow." Without further hesitation, Alice bit into the cake. The effect was even more dramatic than the drink. She shot upward like a rocket, growing and growing until her head pressed against the ceiling of the hall. The world shrank around her, the once imposing furniture now looking like dollhouse miniatures at her feet. "Oh dear," Alice exclaimed, her voice booming in the confined space. "I do believe I've overdone it this time." As she stood there, her head brushing against the ceiling, Alice's elation at solving one problem quickly turned to dismay. She was now far too large to fit through the tiny door, the beautiful garden beyond seeming more unreachable than ever. Tears welled up in her eyes, each one the size of a small pond, threatening to flood the hall. As the first tear splashed to the floor, Alice wondered if she would ever find her way to that magical garden, or if she was doomed to remain trapped in this strange, ever-changing world forever. Alice stood before the tiny door, her heart sinking. She was far too large to fit through the small opening, and this realization filled her with an overwhelming sense of distress. Tears welled up in her eyes, each droplet as big as a marble. They rolled down her cheeks, splashing at her feet with a soft pitter-patter. The sound echoed in the strange room, mixing with her quiet sobs to create a haunting melody of frustration and confusion. As Alice wept, the puddle at her feet grew larger, the water rising steadily. It lapped at her ankles, then her knees, its cool touch a stark contrast to the warmth of her tears. The room seemed to shrink around her, the walls closing in as the pool of her sorrow expanded. Suddenly, a flash of white caught her eye. The white rabbit had reappeared, but he was barely recognizable. Gone was the flustered creature she had chased down the rabbit hole. In his place stood a dapper gentleman, his fur sleek and shiny, dressed in an elegant suit that shimmered like moonlight on water. The rabbit's red eyes darted nervously around the room, his pink nose twitching with anxiety. In his paws, he clutched a pair of pristine white kid gloves and an ornate fan. The items seemed to glow with an otherworldly light, drawing Alice's attention like a moth to a flame. In his haste, the rabbit fumbled with his belongings. The gloves and fan slipped from his grasp, floating down like feathers caught in a gentle breeze. They landed at Alice's feet with a soft plop, barely audible over the lapping of the ever-growing pool of tears. Before Alice could call out to him, the rabbit had scurried away, leaving behind only the faintest scent of carrots and cologne. The aroma tickled her nose, momentarily distracting her from her predicament. Curiosity sparked within her, momentarily overshadowing her sadness. Alice bent to retrieve the fallen items, her fingers brushing against the cool, smooth surface of the fan. It was a work of art, its delicate folds adorned with intricate patterns that seemed to dance before her eyes. Without thinking, she began to fan herself, seeking relief from the stuffy air of the room. The gentle breeze caressed her face, bringing with it a strange, tingling sensation that spread through her body like wildfire. Alice gasped as she felt her very atoms rearranging themselves. The room began to grow around her, or was she shrinking? Her perspective shifted with dizzying speed, the ceiling stretching higher and higher above her. Before she could process what was happening, Alice lost her footing. The world tilted, and she plunged into the pool of her own tears, which had now grown to the size of a vast lake. The salty water engulfed her, its coolness shocking her senses. For a moment, panic seized her heart. The taste of salt filled her mouth, and the water pressed against her eyes, but Alice was nothing if not resourceful. She began to swim, her arms cutting through the water with determined strokes. As she searched for the shore, the absurdity of her situation struck her. Here she was, swimming in a sea of her own making, lost in a world that defied all logic. A hysterical giggle bubbled up inside her, mixing with the water around her. A movement in the water caught her attention. To her amazement, she saw a mouse swimming alongside her, its tiny paws paddling furiously. Its fur was slicked back, its whiskers twitching with each stroke. Eager for companionship in this strange predicament, Alice attempted to strike up a conversation. "Oh, Mr. Mouse," she called out, her voice wavering with the effort of treading water. "Do you know the way to shore? I'm ever so tired of swimming." The mouse turned its beady eyes towards her, a mixture of fear and curiosity in its gaze. It opened its mouth to reply, but Alice, in her excitement, made a grave error. "I do wish my cat Dinah were here," she said wistfully, the memory of her beloved pet bringing a smile to her face. "She's ever so good at catching mice." She stopped abruptly, realizing her mistake as the mouse's eyes widened in terror. The mention of Dinah sent ripples of fear through the water, and suddenly Alice found herself surrounded by a menagerie of swimming creatures. A duck with ruffled feathers, its quacks muffled by the water. A dodo with a look of perpetual confusion, its stubby wings flapping uselessly. A colorful lory, its feathers creating a rainbow in the water, and a stern-faced eaglet, its sharp beak cutting through the waves. As they swam towards what they hoped was the shore, Alice took the lead, her guilt over, frightening the mouse spurring her to help. The motley crew of creatures followed in her wake, creating a surreal procession through the tearful sea. Together they navigated the choppy waters, each stroke bringing them closer to dry land and the promise of new adventures in this topsy-turvy world. Alice, despite her confusion and fatigue, felt a spark of excitement. What other wonders awaited her in this curious place, where pools of tears became oceans and animals could swim and talk? As they neared what appeared to be the shore, a sudden current caught them off guard. The water swirled around them, pulling them in different directions. Alice reached out, trying to grab onto the mouse or any of the other creatures, but her fingers closed on empty water. The shore seemed to stretch further away, and as darkness fell around them, Alice wondered if they would ever reach dry land in this strange, unpredictable world. Alice and the group of wet creatures finally reached the shore, their clothes dripping and their spirits dampened. They huddled together, shivering and wondering how they might dry themselves off in this strange new world. The sand beneath their feet was cool and damp, offering little comfort to their sodden forms. A chilly breeze whispered through the air, carrying with it the faint scent of unfamiliar flowers and distant adventures. The mouse, its fur matted and dripping, puffed out its chest with an air of self-importance. "I know just the thing to warm us up," it squeaked, whiskers twitching with excitement. "A history lesson, dry as dust." Without waiting for a response, the mouse launched into a monotonous recitation of dates and battles, its voice rising and falling in a hypnotic rhythm. Alice felt her eyelids growing heavy as the mouse droned on. She pinched herself to stay awake, her mind wandering to the comfort of her cozy bedroom back home. The soft quilts, the warmth of her cat, Dinah, curled up at her feet. It all seemed a lifetime away now. The other creatures listened with glazed eyes, their fur and feathers still sopping wet, creating small puddles in the sand. Just when Alice thought she couldn't bear another moment of the mouse's lecture, salvation arrived in the form of the dodo. It waddled forward, its eyes gleaming with excitement, stubby wings flapping with enthusiasm. "I have a splendid idea," the dodo exclaimed, its voice cutting through the monotony like a knife. "A Caucus-Race. That'll dry us off in no time." The creatures perked up, their curiosity piqued. The dodo, with an air of authority, began scratching a rough circle in the sand with its beak. The scraping sound filled the air, mixing with the gentle lapping of waves on the shore. "Now everyone, gather round," it squawked. Without warning, the motley crew of animals began running in all directions, their paths crisscrossing like a tangle of colorful yarn. Alice, caught up in the excitement, found herself joining in, her golden hair flying behind her as she ran. The air filled with a cacophony of squeaks, squawks, and giggles as they raced about. The sand kicked up beneath their feet, creating a swirling mist that tickled Alice's nose and made her eyes water. Time seemed to lose all meaning in the chaos of the Caucus-Race. Alice's legs began to ache, her lungs burning with each breath. The world around her became a blur of colors and movement, the laughter and shouts of her fellow racers echoing in her ears. Just as she was about to collapse from exhaustion, the dodo's voice rang out, clear and triumphant. "The race is over," it declared, "and everyone has won." A cheer went up from the breathless participants who gathered around the dodo expectantly. Alice, still panting, looked around in confusion. Her heart raced, partly from exertion and partly from the sheer absurdity of it all. But how can everyone have won? She wondered aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. The dodo turned to her with a twinkle in its eye. "My dear, in a caucus race, everyone always wins. And now, we need prizes." Alice felt all eyes turn to her, and she squirmed uncomfortably. The weight of their expectant gazes made her cheeks flush. I suppose I could find something," she stammered, reaching into her pocket. To her surprise, her fingers closed around a small box of comfits, sugar-coated sweets she had forgotten about. With a smile, Alice began distributing the sweets to the eager creatures. Their eyes lit up as they received their prizes, tiny paws and beaks reaching out eagerly. Alice felt a warm glow of happiness spread through her chest, momentarily forgetting her strange predicament. When she reached the last comfit, she realized she had nothing left for herself. The dodo, noticing her predicament, plucked a small thimble from seemingly nowhere and presented it to her with a flourish. "And here's your prize, my dear," it said kindly. Alice accepted the thimble with a mixture of amusement and gratitude, turning it over in her palm and marveling at its tiny size. The cool metal against her skin was oddly comforting, a small piece of familiarity in this topsy-turvy world. As the excitement of the race died down, the creatures gathered around the mouse once more, their eyes shining with anticipation. "Tell us a story, please," they begged in unison, their voices blending into a melodious chorus. The mouse, unable to resist the spotlight, cleared its throat and began to speak. "Mine is a long and sad tale," it said solemnly, its whiskers drooping dramatically. Alice, her mind still whirling from the day's events, misheard the word tale as tail. She stared at the mouse's long, thin tail, imagining the story winding its way along its length like a river. "It is a long tale, certainly," she said thoughtfully, her brow furrowed in concentration. "But why do you call it sad?" The mouse whirled around, its whiskers quivering with indignation. "I do not," it squeaked angrily, its tiny paws balled into fists. Confusion clouded Alice's face as she tried to understand what had upset the mouse. "But you said—" Before she could finish, the mouse huffed and puffed, its face turning an alarming shade of red. "I shall not stand for such insults," it declared, turning on its heel and marching away, leaving tiny footprints in the damp sand. One by one, the other creatures followed the mouse, their curious eyes darting between Alice and their departing companion. The sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the soft lapping of waves on the shore. Alice felt a pang of loneliness wash over her, as vast and deep as the ocean before her. She hugged her knees to her chest, her eyes scanning the strange landscape around her. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the shore and painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink. The beauty of it all was almost overwhelming, yet it did little to ease the ache in her heart. "Oh, Dinah," she sighed, thinking of her beloved cat back home. "I wish you were here with me. You'd know just what to do in this topsy-turvy world." She could almost feel Dinah's soft fur against her hand, hear her comforting purr. As the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon, Alice wondered what new adventures awaited her in this curious land called Wonderland. The air grew cooler, and she shivered, suddenly feeling very small and alone. Just as she was about to give in to despair, a flash of white caught her eye. Her heart leaped as she recognized the familiar form of the white rabbit, scurrying along the edge of the forest. Without thinking, Alice scrambled to her feet, her fatigue forgotten in the excitement of seeing a familiar face. "Wait!" she called out, her voice carried away by the evening breeze. The rabbit paused, its pink eyes widening as it spotted her. But instead of running away, it began hopping towards her with purpose, its pocket watch swinging wildly. "Mary Ann!" the rabbit exclaimed, its voice shrill with urgency. "What are you doing here? Never mind that. I need you at once." Alice opened her mouth to protest, to explain that she wasn't Mary Ann, but the rabbit was already tugging at her dress, urging her to follow. Confused and curious, Alice allowed herself to be led away from the shore, wondering what new madness this latest encounter would bring. Alice's adventure took an unexpected turn as she encountered the white rabbit once again. This time, however, the rabbit mistook her for his housemaid, Mary Ann, and began issuing orders. "Mary Ann! Mary Ann!" The white rabbit's shrill voice cut through the air, tinged with urgency. His pocket watch glinted in the dappled sunlight as he hopped from foot to foot. "Fetch my gloves and fan at once. I'm dreadfully late." Confusion swirled in Alice's mind like mist, but an irresistible curiosity tugged at her heart. She decided to play along, following the rabbit's hurried directions to his quaint little house. The path twisted and turned, a ribbon of earth winding through a sea of vibrant flowers. Their petals seemed to whisper secrets as she passed, their perfume hanging heavy in the air. Upon entering the rabbit's home, Alice's eyes were immediately drawn to a small bottle sitting on a nearby table. Its contents shimmered invitingly, catching the light like liquid starlight. Hope blossomed in her chest. Perhaps this magical elixir could return her to her normal size. Without a second thought, Alice lifted the bottle to her lips. The liquid was cool and sweet, with a hint of something otherworldly. The effect was instantaneous, but not at all what she had expected. A strange, tingling sensation spread through her body, starting at her toes and racing upwards. To her horror, she began to grow, and grow, and grow. The walls of the house seemed to close in around her, the ceiling pressing down as she expanded. Furniture creaked and groaned under her ever-increasing bulk. Alice's heart raced with panic, each beat echoing in her ears as she realized she was now far too large to fit through any door or window. She was trapped, a giant in a dollhouse. Outside, she heard the white rabbit's approaching footsteps, the soft thud of paws on grass. He tried to enter his home, but the door wouldn't budge an inch. Alice could hear the alarm in his voice as he called out, "What in the world has happened to my house?" The rabbit's panic was contagious, spreading to his neighbors who had gathered to see what all the commotion was about. Their voices rose in a cacophony of concern and wild speculation. Alice listened intently as they debated what to do, feeling like an eavesdropper in her own predicament. "We need someone small to investigate," the rabbit declared, his voice quavering. "Bill! Bill the lizard! You must go down the chimney and see what's causing this dreadful situation." Alice's heart skipped a beat, her palms growing clammy with fear. She couldn't let poor Bill discover her in this state. As she heard the scraping of claws on brick, she positioned herself near the fireplace, ready to act. The sound grew louder, accompanied by the soft shower of soot. The moment Bill's scaly tail appeared, Alice took a deep breath, steeling herself. With all her might, she gave a mighty kick. The lizard shot up the chimney like a cork from a bottle, sailing high into the air with a startled yelp. The gathered creatures gasped in shock as Bill disappeared into the distance, a small green speck against the blue sky. Frustration mounted outside as the rabbit and his friends realized their plan had failed. In a last-ditch effort, they began hurling pebbles through the window. The stones clattered against the floor, but as each one landed, something magical happened. They transformed into little cakes, scattering across the room like tasty breadcrumbs. Alice's eyes widened with realization, a spark of hope igniting in her chest. If drinking from the bottle had made her grow, perhaps eating these cakes would make her shrink. With trembling fingers, she picked up one of the tiny confections. It smelled of vanilla and possibility. She took a cautious bite, the sweetness melting on her tongue. To her immense relief, she felt herself beginning to shrink. The furniture grew larger around her as she dwindled back to a more manageable size. Not wanting to waste a moment, Alice dashed toward the door, her heart pounding with excitement and fear. The wooden floor creaked beneath her feet as she ran, the sound impossibly loud in her ears. She burst out of the house, startling the rabbit and his companions. Their eyes widened in disbelief as they watched the girl they had mistaken for Marianne sprint past them. Alice's lungs burned as she ran, her legs carrying her faster than she thought possible. She disappeared into the nearby wood, leaving behind only confused faces and a house full of unanswered questions. The dense foliage enveloped her, branches reaching out like welcoming arms. As Alice plunged deeper into the heart of the forest, the world around her began to change. The trees grew taller, their trunks twisting into impossible shapes. Flowers of every color imaginable bloomed at her feet, their petals as large as dinner plates. In the distance, she heard a strange, melodious humming that seemed to beckon her forward. With each step, Alice felt herself being drawn further into the mysteries of Wonderland. Unaware of the extraordinary encounters that awaited her in the depths of this enchanted wood, Alice wandered deeper into the wood, her footsteps guided by an insatiable curiosity. The dense foliage seemed to part before her, inviting her further into the heart of this strange and wondrous realm. The air grew thick with a sweet, earthy scent that tickled her nose. Shafts of sunlight pierced through the canopy, creating a dappled pattern on the forest floor. As she pushed aside a curtain of hanging vines, Alice's eyes widened in astonishment. There, perched atop an enormous mushroom, sat the most peculiar creature she had ever seen. It was a caterpillar, as blue as the summer sky, languidly smoking a long, ornate hookah. Its multiple legs dangled off the edge of the toadstool, swaying gently in the breeze. Alice's heart raced with excitement and a touch of apprehension. She approached cautiously, her shoes crunching softly on the carpet of fallen leaves. The caterpillar's antennae twitched, and it turned its gaze upon her. "Who are you?" it drawled, its voice as thick and syrupy as honey. The question hit Alice like a splash of icy water. Her mind reeled, searching for an answer that suddenly seemed just out of reach. Who was she? After all the changes she'd undergone since tumbling down the rabbit hole, she wasn't quite sure anymore. I don't know," she admitted, twisting a lock of her golden hair nervously around her finger. "I knew who I was when I woke up this morning, but I've changed so many times since then." The caterpillar's compound eyes glimmered with interest. "Explain yourself," it commanded, taking a long drag from its hookah. A plume of sweet-smelling smoke curled around its antennae, forming intricate patterns in the air. Alice took a deep breath and launched into her tale. Her words tumbled out in a jumble, like marbles spilling from a bag. She spoke of rabbit holes and talking animals, of growing and shrinking and swimming in pools of tears. The more she spoke, the more confused she felt, her adventures seeming more outlandish with each passing moment. The caterpillar listened in silence, occasionally blowing smoke rings that drifted lazily through the air. Its expression remained impassive, but there was a hint of amusement in the way its antennae twitched. Suddenly it spoke. "Recite you are old, Father William." Caught off guard, Alice blinked in surprise. She opened her mouth and began to recite, her voice shaky at first but growing stronger with each line. However, as she progressed, the words became tangled in her mind like a ball of yarn. She mixed up verses, substituted words, and completely forgot entire stanzas. "That's not right," the caterpillar said flatly, its antennae drooping with disapproval. Frustration bubbled up inside Alice like a pot left too long on the stove. Her cheeks flushed red, and she stamped her foot, sending a small cloud of dust into the air. "Well, I can't help it," she exclaimed, her voice echoing through the trees. "Everything's so topsy-turvy here. I'm constantly changing size, and it's making my head spin." The caterpillar regarded her calmly, seemingly unperturbed by her outburst. It took another long drag from its hookah, the smoke swirling around it like a misty halo. When it spoke again, its voice was cryptic and measured. "One side will make you grow taller," it said, gesturing to the mushroom with one of its many legs. Alice's frustration gave way to confusion. "One side of what?" "The mushroom," the caterpillar replied, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. A spark of hope ignited in Alice's chest, spreading warmth through her body. "And the other side?" The other side will make you shorter, the caterpillar explained, its monotonous voice holding a hint of amusement. Before Alice could ask any more questions, the caterpillar began to crawl away, its body undulating like a wave of blue silk. Just as it was about to disappear into the undergrowth, it turned back. Oh, and when I say grow, I'm referring to your neck, of course. With that puzzling clarification, the caterpillar vanished, leaving Alice alone with the mushroom and her swirling thoughts. The forest seemed to close in around her, the trees whispering secrets she couldn't quite understand. For a moment, Alice stood still, processing the strange encounter. Then, with determination glinting in her eyes, she broke off pieces from both sides of the mushroom. The fragments felt cool and slightly damp in her palm, like dewdrops on a leaf. Here goes nothing, she murmured, bringing a piece to her lips. She took a tiny nibble, her heart pounding with anticipation. Instantly, she shot upward like a rocket, her head brushing against the leaves of a nearby tree. Birds squawked in alarm and took flight, their wings stirring up a small whirlwind around her. Oh, she gasped, quickly taking a bite from the other piece. She shrank rapidly, the world growing enormous around her. She barely caught herself before she became too small, the blades of grass now towering over her like a forest. For the next few minutes, Alice experimented, nibbling first one piece, then the other. She grew tall as a house, her head poking through the canopy, then small as a mouse, scurrying between the roots of ancient trees. She giggled despite herself at the absurdity of it all, her laughter ringing through the wood. Finally, with one last careful bite, Alice found herself back at her normal height. She stood up straight, marveling at the feeling of being just the right size again. The forest no longer seemed so overwhelming, and a smile spread across her face as she tucked the remaining mushroom pieces into her pocket. With her newfound ability to control her size, Alice felt a surge of confidence. The strange world around her suddenly seemed a little less daunting and a lot more exciting. She took a deep breath, inhaling the rich scent of earth and magic that permeated the air. With a spring in her step and curiosity burning bright in her heart, Alice set off deeper into Wonderland. The path before her twisted and turned, disappearing into the shadows of the forest. As she walked, the trees seemed to lean in closer, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. The air grew thick with mist, and strange, ethereal sounds echoed in the distance. Alice's heart raced with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. What new wonders or dangers awaited her in the depths of this mysterious wood? With each step, the unknown beckoned, promising adventures beyond her wildest dreams. The forest closed in around her, swallowing her up in its verdant embrace as Alice ventured forth into the heart of Wonderland. Alice wandered through the dense, mysterious wood. Her curiosity grew with each step, drawing her deeper into the unknown. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and unfamiliar flora, while strange, muffled sounds echoed in the distance. Her heart raced with a mixture of excitement and trepidation as she pushed aside low-hanging branches, their leaves brushing against her face like ghostly fingers. Suddenly, the trees parted, revealing a small house nestled among the gnarled trunks. Its quaint appearance stood in stark contrast to the wild, untamed forest surrounding it. Alice approached cautiously, her footsteps muffled by the carpet of fallen leaves. The house seemed to beckon her, its windows like eyes watching her every move. With trembling fingers, Alice pushed open the creaky door. The hinges groaned in protest, as if warning her to turn back, but her curiosity won out, and she stepped inside. The scene that greeted her was nothing short of chaos incarnate. In the center of the room sat the Duchess, an ugly woman whose sharp chin could have sliced through butter. She cradled a wailing baby in her arms, her expression a disconcerting mix of annoyance and utter indifference. The infant's cries pierced the air like tiny daggers, making Alice wince. The atmosphere was thick and oppressive, laden with the acrid scent of pepper. Alice's nose twitched violently, and her eyes began to water. Through the haze, she spotted the source, a cook at the stove, vigorously stirring a massive cauldron of soup. With each stir, the cook tossed in handful after handful of pepper, sending billowing clouds of the spice into the air. Sneezes erupted from every corner, punctuating the cacophony of noise like percussive explosions. As Alice's watery gaze swept the room, a peculiar sight in the corner caught her attention. A large cat lounged there, its fur a mesmerizing swirl of muted colors that seemed to shift and change as she watched. But what truly captured her focus was its grin, wide and mischievous, stretching from ear to ear in a way that defied nature. This, she realized with a start, must be the famed Cheshire Cat she'd heard whispers about in her journey through Wonderland. The tension in the room was palpable, like a rubber band stretched to its breaking point. The baby's cries grew louder, competing with the clanging of pots and pans as the cook hurled them across the kitchen in a pepper-induced frenzy. Pots ricocheted off walls, their metallic clangs adding to the din. The Duchess, seemingly unperturbed by the mayhem, occasionally lifted the squalling infant and tossed it unceremoniously at Alice. Each time Alice's heart leapt into her throat as she scrambled to catch the child, her arms outstretched and her body tense. Suddenly, a barrage of kitchen utensils came flying toward the Duchess like a swarm of angry metal insects. With a grunt of frustration that sounded more annoyed than concerned, she thrust the baby into Alice's arms. "I'm off to play croquet with the Queen," she declared, her voice cutting through the chaos. Before Alice could protest, the Duchess had vanished out the door in a whirlwind of skirts and pepper-induced sneezes, leaving her alone with the screaming child. Overwhelmed by the noise and the pepper-laden air that felt like it was scouring her lungs, Alice stumbled outside. She clutched the baby close, its warmth and weight a strange comfort in the midst of the madness. As she gulped in the fresh woodland air, the scent of pine and wildflowers replacing the burning pepper, she glanced down at the bundle in her arms. To her utter astonishment, the baby had transformed into a pig. Its little snout twitched, and it let out a contented oink that seemed absurdly out of place after the cacophony inside. Bewildered but oddly relieved, Alice gently set the pig baby down on the soft forest floor. It trotted off into the woods, its curly tail bouncing happily as it disappeared into the undergrowth. As she watched it vanish, a familiar voice purred behind her, sending a shiver down her spine. Curious and curiouser, isn't it? The Cheshire Cat materialized on a nearby branch, its grin as wide and unsettling as ever. Its body seemed to shimmer in and out of existence, like heat waves on a summer day. Alice, still reeling from the bizarre events, found herself drawn into a perplexing conversation with the enigmatic feline. The cat's words danced around her like smoke, appearing and disappearing as quickly as the creature itself. Its eyes, large and luminous, seemed to peer into her very soul. "If you're looking for some semblance of sanity," the cat drawled, its tail swishing lazily back and forth like a metronome, "you might try the March Hare's house, or perhaps the Mad Hatter's." Its grin widened impossibly further. "Though I warn you, everyone here is mad, including you, my dear." As Alice pondered this unsettling declaration, her mind whirling with questions and doubts, the cat began to fade away. First its tail, then its body, until only that unnerving grin remained suspended in the air. The sight of it hanging there, detached from any face, sent a chill racing down Alice's spine. It was like a crescent moon made of sharp teeth and secrets. Left alone once more, Alice stood in the quiet of the woods, her mind a tempest of confusion and wonder. The strange nature of Wonderland seemed to seep into her very bones, leaving her to question everything she thought she knew. In this topsy-turvy world, where babies turned to pigs and cats disappeared at will, who could truly claim to be sane? As the last echoes of the Cheshire Cat's words faded away, Alice felt a pull, an inexplicable urge to seek out this March Hare and Mad Hatter. Perhaps they held the key to understanding this mad world, or perhaps they would only plunge her deeper into the rabbit hole of insanity. With a deep breath, Alice squared her shoulders and set off in the direction the Cheshire Cat's grin had last pointed. The forest seemed to shift around her, trees bending and paths twisting, as if Wonderland itself was leading her towards her next adventure. Her heart pounded with a mixture of fear and excitement as she pushed forward, unaware of the madness that awaited her at the March Hare's house. Alice followed the Cheshire Cat's puzzling directions, her heart pounding with anticipation. She soon found herself standing before the March Hare's house, a sight that made her eyes widen in wonder. The scene before her was a whimsical blend of order and chaos, like a painting come to life. A long table stretched out under the twisted branches of an ancient tree, its gnarled bark seeming to whisper secrets of countless tea parties past. The table's surface was a haphazard landscape of mismatched teacups, saucers, and plates, each one telling its own story of chips and cracks. Despite the abundance of empty chairs, three peculiar characters huddled at one end of the table, their elbows bumping as they sipped their tea with exaggerated motions. The March Hare's fur stood on end, his ears twitching like antennae picking up invisible signals. Beside him, the Mad Hatter's eyes darted about wildly beneath the brim of his comically oversized hat. Between them, barely visible, a tiny dormouse dozed peacefully, occasionally mumbling in its sleep. Alice's footsteps crunched on the gravel path, sounding unnaturally loud in the surreal setting. The trio's heads snapped up in unison, their expressions a comical mix of surprise and annoyance. "No room! No room!" they chorused, their voices a cacophony of squeaks and growls. Confusion and indignation bubbled up inside Alice like a shaken bottle of fizzy drink. She gestured at the sea of empty chairs, her frustration evident in every movement. "But there's plenty of room," she protested, her voice rising slightly. Without waiting for an invitation that she sensed would never come, Alice marched over to a large ornate armchair at the opposite end of the table and plopped herself down with a soft oomph. The Mad Hatter leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with mischief. His voice rose and fell like a carnival ride as he announced, "I've got a riddle for you. Why is a raven like a writing desk?" Alice's brow furrowed as she pondered the nonsensical question. The air around her seemed to thicken with anticipation, the very leaves on the tree holding their breath. But before she could venture a guess, the Hatter shrugged dramatically, his shoulders nearly touching his ears. "I haven't the faintest idea," he declared, erupting into a fit of giggles that set his teacup dancing across its saucer. The March Hare, seemingly caught up in the Hatter's mirth, suddenly thrust a teapot in Alice's direction. His paw shook so violently that tea sloshed over the rim, creating a miniature rainstorm on the tablecloth. "Care for some wine?" he offered, his voice quivering like a plucked violin string. "Yes, please," Alice replied, her ingrained politeness winning out over her growing exasperation. But her hopes for a moment of normalcy were quickly dashed as the Hare's face contorted into an expression of mock horror. "We're all out of wine," he exclaimed, slamming the teapot down with such force that the table rattled. The dormouse, nestled in a nearby sugar bowl, jerked awake with a startled squeak, sugar crystals clinging to its whiskers like tiny, edible jewels. As the tea party progressed, Alice found herself caught in a whirlwind of nonsense and bewildering behavior. The Hatter and March Hare danced around the table like autumn leaves caught in a playful breeze, swapping seats and dirty dishes with gleeful abandon. Their words tumbled out in a jumble of riddles and non sequiturs, leaving Alice's head spinning as she tried to keep up. The dormouse, barely able to keep its tiny eyes open, launched into a convoluted tale about three sisters who lived at the bottom of a treacle well. Its voice was a soft, sleepy murmur that seemed to lull the very air around them into a drowsy haze. Alice found herself leaning in, straining to catch every word, only to realize that the story made less sense the more she heard. Throughout it all, Alice's frustration grew like a bubble in her chest, expanding with each passing moment. The rudeness of her hosts, the absurdity of their logic, and the sheer chaos of the scene before her grated on her nerves like sandpaper on silk. She could feel her patience wearing thin, like a thread about to snap. As she watched the Hatter pour tea into the dormouse's saucer, using the creature's whiskers as a makeshift napkin, something inside Alice finally gave way. The bubble of frustration burst, releasing a torrent of exasperation that she could no longer contain. "This is the stupidest tea party I've ever been to in all my life," she declared, her voice ringing out across the cluttered table like a bell. The words hung in the air, seeming to echo off the teacups and saucers. With a huff of indignation, she pushed back her chair and stood up, smoothing down her apron with trembling hands. The Hatter, March Hare, and Dormouse barely seemed to notice her outburst, continuing their mad tea party as if nothing had happened. Their laughter and nonsensical chatter faded into the background as Alice stormed away from the table, her footsteps quick and determined. As she marched down the path, leaving the mad tea party behind, Alice made a silent vow to herself. Never again would she attend such a ridiculous gathering. The sound of clinking teacups and nonsensical laughter grew fainter with each step. But the memory of the bizarre experience clung to her, like the lingering scent of oversteeped tea. Alice continued her journey through the peculiar Wonderland, her curiosity unabated despite her recent frustrations. As she wandered, her mind still buzzing with the absurdity of the tea party, her eyes suddenly widened at an extraordinary sight before her. She froze mid-step, her heart racing as she tried to make sense of what she was seeing. What new madness awaited her in this topsy-turvy world? Alice continued her journey through the peculiar Wonderland, her curiosity unabated. As she wandered, her eyes widened at an extraordinary sight before her. A massive tree stood proudly, its bark twisted and gnarled with age. But what truly caught her attention was the small door nestled within its trunk, as if it had grown there naturally. Her heart raced with excitement as she approached. The air around her seemed to hum with possibility, the very leaves of the tree rustling with anticipation. Alice reached out, her fingers trembling slightly as they brushed against the smooth wood of the door. With a gentle push, it creaked open, the sound echoing in the stillness of the forest. A rush of cool air washed over her as she stepped through, bringing with it a sense of déjà vu. Alice blinked in surprise, finding herself once again in the great hall with its familiar glass table. The surface gleamed in the soft, ethereal light that seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere at once. Memories of her earlier adventures flooded back, and Alice's hand instinctively went to her pocket. There, safely tucked away, was the piece of mushroom she had kept. With careful, measured nibbles, she adjusted her size. The world around her seemed to stretch and shrink, a dizzying sensation that left her breathless. Finally, she stood at just the right height to pass through the small door that had once seemed so impossibly tiny. Taking a deep breath to steady herself, Alice stepped through. The change was immediate and overwhelming. A wave of warm, fragrant air enveloped her, carrying with it the sweet scent of 1,000 blooms. She gasped, her eyes widening in wonder as she beheld a garden of breathtaking beauty. Flowers of every hue imaginable stretched as far as the eye could see, their petals dancing gently in the breeze. Roses as red as rubies stood proudly next to daisies of purest white. Violets of the deepest purple nestled against sunflowers that seemed to glow with their own inner light. The grass beneath her feet was a lush, vibrant green, soft as velvet against her skin. But amidst this tranquil scene, something peculiar caught her eye. 3 figures, unlike anything Alice had ever seen before, were scurrying about a rosebush. As she drew closer, her curiosity piqued. She realized they were shaped oddly like playing cards, but with arms and legs. Their movements were frantic, almost comical, as they wielded paintbrushes with surprising dexterity. "Oh my!" Alice exclaimed, her voice cutting through the air and startling the gardeners. "Whatever are you doing?" The card people froze, their eyes wide with fear. Paint dripped from their brushes, splattering onto the grass below. For a moment, the only sound was the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze. Then slowly, one of the gardeners stepped forward, his face etched with worry. We planted white roses by mistake," he said, his voice quivering like a leaf in a storm. "If the Queen of Hearts sees them, she'll have our heads for sure." Alice's heart clenched at the palpable fear in his voice. The other gardeners nodded vigorously, their bodies trembling as they glanced nervously over their shoulders. The atmosphere in the garden had shifted, the earlier tranquility replaced by a tension so thick Alice could almost taste it. Before she could offer any words of comfort, a commotion in the distance caught their attention. The ground seemed to tremble, and the flowers swayed as if in anticipation. A grand procession was approaching, led by 2 figures that radiated power and authority. The King and Queen of Hearts swept into view, surrounded by a retinue of card soldiers. The Queen, a figure of terrifying majesty, dominated the scene. Her gaze swept across the garden like a hawk searching for prey, her eyes sharp and calculating. When they locked onto Alice, the young girl felt a chill run down her spine. "Who is this?" the Queen demanded, her voice booming across the garden. The flowers seemed to shrink back, and even the sun appeared to dim in her presence. Alice felt her knees weaken. But she summoned every ounce of courage she possessed. Standing as straight as she could, she met the queen's gaze. "I'm Alice, your majesty," she replied, dropping into a curtsy that she hoped was graceful enough. The tension in the air was palpable as the queen scrutinized her. Alice could hear her own heart pounding in her ears, each second stretching into an eternity. Then, to her surprise and relief, the queen's expression softened ever so slightly. "Very well," she declared, her voice still commanding, but with a hint of curiosity. "You shall join us for a game of croquet." What followed was unlike any game Alice had ever experienced or even imagined. Live flamingos served as mallets, their long necks bending awkwardly as players attempted to hit hedgehogs that curled into balls. The poor creatures looked utterly bewildered, their eyes wide with confusion as they were batted across the lawn. The card soldiers contorted themselves into arches, their faces strained with the effort of holding still. Alice couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy for them as she watched their limbs tremble under the strain. Chaos reigned supreme on the croquet field. The queen, her face flushed with a mixture of excitement and anger, bellowed, "Off with their head!" at the slightest provocation. Each time she uttered those dreaded words, Alice felt her heart skip a beat, horror washing over her at the thought of such casual cruelty. Yet as the game progressed, Alice noticed something curious. Despite the queen's frequent outbursts, nobody seemed to actually lose their head. The king, a much milder figure who seemed almost lost in the shadow of his formidable wife, quietly pardoned each condemned soul when the queen wasn't looking. It was a small act of mercy in a world that seemed to have gone mad. As Alice struggled to control her unwieldy flamingo mallet, coaxing her hedgehog ball into cooperating, a familiar sight caught her eye. A grin, wide and mischievous, materialized in the air above the croquet field. The Cheshire Cat had arrived, adding another layer of surrealism to the already bizarre scene. The cat's appearance only served to further agitate the already volatile queen. "Off with its head!" she shrieked, pointing at the floating feline smile. But how does one behead a grin? Alice wondered, feeling as though she had stumbled into a world where logic and reason had been turned upside down. Alice's head spun as she tried to make sense of the madness around her. The flamingo in her hands squawked indignantly, twisting its neck to avoid the hedgehog. The hedgehog, seeming to have had quite enough of being a croquet ball, rolled away in fright, disappearing into a nearby flower bed. And through it all, the Cheshire Cat's grin widened impossibly further, hovering above the chaos like a bemused spectator. As the game descended further into absurdity, Alice found herself both bewildered and oddly exhilarated. This was a world beyond her wildest dreams, where logic held no sway and the impossible became commonplace. With each passing moment, she felt herself being drawn deeper into the wonderful, whimsical, and utterly absurd realm of Wonderland. The sun began to dip low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the croquet field. The flowers seemed to glow in the golden light, their colors more vibrant than ever. Alice, her arms aching from wielding the flamingo mallet, paused to catch her breath. She watched as the queen stormed across the field, her face a thundercloud of rage as she berated a trembling card soldier. Suddenly, the air around Alice seemed to still. The chaotic sounds of the game faded away, replaced by an eerie silence. She turned, her heart pounding, to find the Queen of Hearts approaching, her face a mask of regal authority. What new madness would this encounter bring? The chaotic croquet game continued, its madness swirling around Alice like a whirlwind. Amidst the commotion, the Queen of Hearts approached, her face a mask of regal authority. Alice's heart raced as the queen drew near, her imperious presence sending ripples of tension through the air. The young girl's fingers trembled, her palms slick with sweat as she gripped her flamingo mallet tighter. The queen's eyes, dark and piercing, locked onto Alice's, and for a moment, the cacophony of the game faded into the background. "Come, child," the queen commanded, her voice sharp as a blade. "There's someone you must meet." Before Alice could respond, the queen swept her arm in a grand gesture, revealing a creature so extraordinary that Alice's breath caught in her throat. Standing tall and proud was a magnificent griffin, its eagle head held high, sharp eyes gleaming with intelligence. Magnificent wings folded neatly against its lion's body, rustled softly in the breeze. Alice's eyes widened, drinking in every detail of the mythical beast. Its feathers shimmered with hues of gold and bronze, while its powerful leonine haunches rippled with barely contained strength. The creature's presence was both awe-inspiring and slightly unnerving, sending a shiver down Alice's spine. "The griffin will take you to meet the mock turtle," the queen declared, her tone brooking no argument. "He'll tell you his history, he will." Before Alice could muster the courage to protest, the queen had swept away, leaving her alone with the imposing creature. The griffin fixed its piercing gaze on Alice, then jerked its head in a "follow me" gesture. Its beak clacked softly, an oddly reassuring sound in the midst of Wonderland's chaos. As they walked, the griffin's claws clicked against the ground, creating an odd rhythm that seemed to match the erratic beating of Alice's heart. The neatly manicured Croquet-Grounds began to give way to wilder, more rugged terrain. Gnarled trees with leaves in impossible shades of purple and blue loomed overhead, their branches reaching out like grasping fingers. "Don't you worry about those executions," the griffin said suddenly, its voice a strange mix of bird-like screech and feline purr. "It's all her fancy, that. They never executes nobody, you know." Alice felt a wave of relief wash over her, though confusion still clouded her mind. She opened her mouth to ask a question, but the words died on her lips as a curious sight came into view. Perched atop a moss-covered rock was a creature unlike any Alice had ever seen. It had the head of a calf, complete with large, doleful eyes, but its body was encased in the shell of a turtle. Tears streamed down its face, creating tiny rivulets in the rock beneath it. The air around the creature seemed heavy with sorrow, and Alice felt a pang of sympathy tug at her heart. "This here's the mock turtle," the griffin announced, its tone softening slightly. "What you crying for?" it asked the creature, not unkindly. The mock turtle's sobs subsided for a moment as it gazed at Alice with watery eyes. "Once," it began, its voice thick with emotion, "I was a real turtle." Alice's heart went out to the strange creature. She sat down on a nearby rock, the cool, damp surface seeping through her dress. The forest around them seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the mock turtle's tale to unfold. "When we were little," the mock turtle continued, hiccuping slightly, "we went to school in the sea. The master was an old turtle. We used to call him Tortoise." "Why did you call him Tortoise if he wasn't one?" Alice interrupted, curiosity getting the better of her. The moment the words left her mouth, she regretted them, feeling the weight of the mock turtle's glare. "We called him Tortoise because he taught us," it said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "Really, you are very dull." Alice bit her lip, chastened. The griffin chuckled, a sound like grinding stones that sent a shiver down her spine. As the mock turtle launched into a description of its education, Alice found herself swept up in a world of bewildering subjects and impossible lessons. "Reeling and writhing," it said, and then the different branches of arithmetic: ambition, distraction, uglification, and derision. Alice's head spun as she tried to make sense of it all. It was like trying to grasp smoke. The more she reached for understanding, the more it slipped away. The forest around them seemed to shift and change with each new revelation, mirroring the confusion in Alice's mind. "And then," the mock turtle continued, its voice quavering, "the classical master taught us mystery, ancient and modern." A fresh wave of tears threatened to spill over, and Alice found herself reaching out instinctively to comfort the creature before pulling her hand back. "And how many hours a day did you do lessons?" asked Alice, hoping to distract the creature from its sorrow. 10 hours the first day," said the mock turtle, 9 the next, and so on." "What a curious plan," exclaimed Alice, her mind whirling with the implications. "That's the reason they're called lessons," the griffin remarked, its beak clacking in what might have been amusement. "Because they lesson from day to day." This was such a new idea to Alice that she sat silent for a minute or two, considering it. The forest seemed to grow darker around them, shadows lengthening as the sun dipped lower in the sky. The mock turtle seized the opportunity to resume its story, its voice rising and falling like the tide, as it recounted tales of sea-school days long past. As the mock turtle's narrative meandered on, punctuated by frequent sobs and the griffin's impatient urgings to continue, Alice found herself lost in a world of underwater classrooms and conger eel teachers. The strange, sad creature's emotional recounting of its youth left her bewildered, caught between sympathy for its apparent distress and confusion at the bizarre nature of its memories. The sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the rocky outcropping where they sat. Still, the mock turtle's tale continued, each revelation more perplexing than the last. Alice listened, her mind whirling with images of the strange underwater school system, trying to make sense of a world where lessons lessened and arithmetic included uglification. As twilight approached, Alice found herself more confused than ever, caught between the lingering echoes of the chaotic croquet game and the bewildering world of the mock turtle's memories. She sat listening with a mixture of fascination and bewilderment as the creature's emotional recounting of its youth continued unabated into the gathering dusk. Suddenly, the mock turtle fell silent, its large eyes brimming with unshed tears. Alice leaned forward, her heart pounding with anticipation. What new revelation was coming? What strange twist would the mock turtle's tale take next? As she watched, a flicker of excitement crossed the creature's face, and it opened its mouth to speak. The mock turtle sat in melancholy silence, his large eyes brimming with unshed tears. After a moment, he perked up slightly, a flicker of excitement crossing his face as he decided to share a cherished memory from his youth with Alice. "Oh, you simply must see it," he exclaimed, his voice wavering between excitement and sorrow. The words hung in the air, heavy with nostalgia. "The Lobster Quadrille dance!" The griffin, lounging nearby, pricked up his ears at the mention of the dance. With surprising agility for his size, he leapt to his feet, feathers ruffling with enthusiasm. "I'll be your partner, old chap," he said, giving the mock turtle a friendly nudge that nearly toppled the creature. Alice leaned forward, her curiosity piqued. The salty sea breeze tousled her hair as she watched the odd pair position themselves on the sandy shore. The mock turtle cleared his throat, the sound like pebbles rattling in a tin can, and began to sing. His voice carried a tune that was both merry and melancholic, echoing across the waves. "Will you walk a little faster?" said a whiting to a snail. "There's a porpoise close behind us, and he's treading on my tail." As they sang, the mock turtle and griffin began to move. Their dance was a sight to behold, a graceful, otherworldly ballet that seemed to defy the laws of nature. The griffin's talons left intricate patterns in the sand, while the mock turtle's flippers barely seemed to touch the ground. Alice watched, mesmerized, her eyes wide with wonder. "You see," the mock turtle explained between verses, his voice slightly breathless, "the sea creatures pair up, like so." He gestured to himself and the griffin with a flipper. Then they advanced, and he continued, as they took a few steps forward, their movements fluid as the tide. "And then?" Alice asked, completely engrossed. She could almost smell the salt of the sea, hear the distant cry of gulls as she imagined the underwater dance. The griffin's beak curved into a mischievous grin. "Then we throw our partners out to sea." He made a grand sweeping motion with his wing, nearly knocking the mock turtle off balance. The poor creature teetered precariously, his shell gleaming in the sunlight as he fought to stay upright. "Oh my!" Alice gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. In her mind's eye, she saw a chaotic scene of sea creatures being flung about, their scales glinting as they soared through the air before splashing back into the waves. "And finally," the mock turtle added, regaining his composure with a slight wobble, "we change lobsters and dance again." Alice's mind whirled, attempting to piece together this complex underwater ballet. The image of lobsters being swapped like dance partners was both amusing and bewildering. She could almost feel the cool water around her ankles, hear the clacking of claws as the crustaceans changed hands. As the demonstration came to an end, the griffin and mock turtle turned to Alice expectantly. Their eyes shone with the exhilaration of the dance, and a thin sheen of sweat glistened on the mock turtle's brow. "Now it's your turn, dear," the griffin said, his voice rough but kind. "Recite us a poem." Alice hesitated, her heart fluttering like a trapped butterfly. She took a deep breath, tasting salt on her tongue, and began, "'Tis the voice of the sluggard." But as she spoke, The words seemed to tangle on her tongue. Fragments of other poems she knew mixed in, creating a jumble of nonsensical verses that tumbled from her lips like pebbles down a hillside. The mock turtle and griffin exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of confusion and amusement. "That's not how I remember it," the mock turtle said, shaking his head slowly, his eyes clouding with perplexity. "Nor I," added the griffin, scratching his head with a talon. The sound was like sandpaper on wood. "The words are all different." Alice felt a blush creeping up her cheeks, hot and prickly. "I'm sorry," she mumbled, her voice small and embarrassed. "I seem to have mixed things up." The mock turtle, seeing her discomfort, decided to change the subject. His eyes softened with sympathy, and he began to sing again. This time, the song that poured from him was so sorrowful it seemed to make the very air around them heavy with sadness. "Beautiful soup, so rich and green, waiting in a hot tureen. Who for such dainties would not stoop? Soup of the evening, beautiful soup." As he sang about turtle soup, his voice quavered with emotion. Each note seemed to hang in the air, shimmering with melancholy before dissipating like mist. Alice felt a lump forming in her throat, moved by the raw feeling in the mock turtle's song. The world around her seemed to fade, leaving only the haunting melody and the ache it stirred in her heart. Suddenly, a distant cry shattered the melancholy atmosphere. "The trial's beginning!" The voice echoed across the landscape, urgent and demanding, cutting through the song like a knife through butter. The griffin's head snapped up, his eyes wide with alarm. Without a word, he grabbed Alice's hand in his talon, surprisingly gentle despite his haste. "Come on!" he cried, already beginning to run. Alice found herself being pulled along, her feet barely touching the ground as the griffin raced towards the source of the cry. The world blurred around her, a kaleidoscope of colors and shapes. She glanced back over her shoulder, catching a final glimpse of the mock turtle. There he sat, alone on the shore, his mournful song continuing unabated. The sound grew fainter as Alice was whisked away, but the image of the solitary figure singing his heart out to an empty beach stayed with her. It was a picture of loneliness that seemed to etch itself into her very soul. As they raced towards their unknown destination, Alice's heart pounded in her chest. The griffin's grip on her hand tightened, and she could feel the urgency in his steps. The cry of "the trial's beginning" still echoed in her ears, mixing with the fading notes of the mock turtle's song. What trial? Who was on trial? And why did it feel so terribly important? These questions swirled in Alice's mind as they approached what looked like a grand courthouse looming in the distance. The building seemed to grow larger with each step, its imposing facade sending a shiver down Alice's spine. As they drew nearer, she could feel a strange tension in the air, as if the very atmosphere was charged with anticipation and dread. Alice and the griffin approached the courthouse, their hearts racing with anticipation. A trial was about to begin, and the air crackled with an electric tension that set their nerves on edge. The grand courtroom unfolded before them like a scene from a fever dream. Atop ornate thrones that seemed to shimmer in the dancing candlelight sat the king and queen of hearts. Their regal attire glittered and gleamed, a stark contrast to the motley crew that surrounded them. Birds with ruffled feathers shifted nervously on their perches, while animals of all shapes and sizes huddled together, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and curiosity. The entire deck of cards stood at attention, their flat bodies swaying slightly in the stuffy air, looking for all the world like toy soldiers awaiting orders. In the center of this bizarre tableau stood the Knave of Hearts, a pitiful figure despite his royal title. Heavy chains bound his wrists, each nervous twitch accompanied by a mournful clink that echoed through the hushed courtroom. Alice's heart clenched with sympathy as she watched the poor fellow tremble, accused of the grievous crime of stealing the Queen's prized tarts. The White Rabbit, puffed up with self-importance in his role as herald, cleared his throat with a sound like rustling parchment. He unrolled a scroll, the edges curling around his paws, and began to read the accusation. His voice, usually a timid squeak, now rang out with an authority that seemed to surprise even him, the words bouncing off the stone walls and filling every corner of the room. Just as the gravity of the situation began to settle over the assembly, the doors burst open with a thunderous crack. In stumbled the Mad Hatter, a whirlwind of color and chaos. His beloved teacup sloshed in one hand, while the other clutched a half-eaten slice of bread and butter as if it were a lifeline. The Hatter's eyes, wide and wild, darted around the room like marbles in a jar, taking in the scene with a manic energy that was almost palpable. His hat, a towering creation that defied the laws of physics, teetered precariously atop his shock of untamed hair. "You're late!" The king's voice boomed through the courtroom, his face flushing a shade of red that would have made a tomato jealous. The Hatter, unfazed by the royal reprimand, merely grinned and took a sip from his teacup. What followed was a testimony unlike any Alice had ever witnessed. The Hatter's words tumbled out in a dizzying stream of consciousness, bouncing from topic to topic with the grace of a drunken acrobat. He expounded on the exact moment he began his tea party, down to the second, then veered wildly into a passionate discourse on the exorbitant price of his hat. The courtroom fell into a state of utter bewilderment, heads spinning as they tried to follow the Hatter's meandering train of thought. The king, his brow furrowed in concentration, leaned forward on his throne, desperately trying to make sense of the madman's ramblings. It was a futile effort, like trying to catch the smoke with bare hands. Each time he thought he'd grasped a thread of logic, it slipped away, leaving him more confused than before. Meanwhile, the queen's face darkened with each passing moment, her fingers twitching at her sides as if longing to shout her favorite decree. "Off with his head!" Just when it seemed the chaos couldn't possibly escalate, the Duchess's cook was called to the stand. The stout woman stomped up to the witness box, each heavy footfall echoing through the courtroom. Her face was set in a scowl so fierce it could have curdled milk at 20 paces. When questioned, she crossed her arms over her ample bosom and glared at the court with a defiance that was almost admirable. Not a single word passed her lips, but her silence spoke volumes. Throughout this circus of a trial, Alice felt a strange sensation creeping over her. It started as a tingling in her toes, then spread upwards, a warmth that seemed to stretch her very being. With a start, she realized she was growing larger, inch by inch, until her head nearly brushed the ceiling. The courtroom erupted into pandemonium at the sight. Animals scurried for cover, their tiny claws scrabbling against the polished floor. Playing cards fluttered about like leaves caught in a storm, their panicked faces a blur of red and black. The king, his crown now askew atop his head, frantically leafed through a thick book of rules. His eyes lit up with triumph as he found what he was looking for. "Rule 42, he shouted, his voice cracking with excitement. "All persons more than a mile high must leave the court immediately." Alice, now towering over the assembly like a giant among ants, felt a surge of courage course through her veins. She was too big to be pushed around anymore, too large to be cowed by the nonsensical rules of this topsy-turvy world. With a voice that boomed like thunder, she challenged the king. "That's not a proper rule. You just made it up." The king sputtered and stammered, his face cycling through an impressive array of colors. But Alice stood her ground, her newfound size giving her the confidence to speak her mind. She pointed out the absurdity of the entire trial, her words cutting through the nonsense like a hot knife through butter. The logic of her argument was a beacon of sanity in the sea of madness that surrounded them. As Alice continued to argue with the king about the validity of his hastily invented rule, the courtroom descended into chaos once more. Cards flew through the air like confetti, animals screeched in a cacophony of panic, and the queen's face turned a shade of red that would make a fire engine green with envy. But Alice, now too large to be intimidated, continued to stand tall, both literally and figuratively, against the madness that surrounded her. The air in the courtroom crackled with an almost tangible energy. Alice's heart pounded in her chest, each beat reverberating through her enlarged body. She opened her mouth to deliver another scathing retort, but before she could speak, a hush fell over the assembly. All eyes turned to the king, who had risen from his throne, his face a mask of grim determination. With a voice that carried the weight of royal decree, he uttered words that sent a chill down Alice's spine. "The court calls Alice to testify." The trial had reached its climax. Tension thick in the air. Alice, now at her full size, was called to testify. Her heart pounded like a drum as she stood up, her newfound height causing her to accidentally knock over the jury box. The sound of tumbling bodies filled the courtroom, followed by a chorus of squeaks and protests. Guilt washed over Alice like a cold wave as she watched the tiny jurors scatter across the floor. They looked like frightened mice, their little limbs flailing as they tried to right themselves. With trembling hands, she began to scoop them up, feeling their tiny bodies squirming against her palms. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice quivering as she carefully placed each juror back in their seat. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs and disapproving glances, making Alice's cheeks burn with embarrassment. The king, his golden crown sitting slightly askew atop his head, fixed Alice with a piercing stare. His eyes narrowed, reminding her of a cat eyeing its prey. "What do you know about this case?" he demanded, his voice booming through the room like a clap of thunder. Alice's mind went blank, her thoughts scattering like leaves in a strong wind. She felt exposed, vulnerable, like a fish suddenly plucked from the safety of its pond. "Nothing," she stammered, her voice barely audible even to her own ears. The tension in the room was palpable, pressing down on Alice like a heavy blanket. Just as she thought she might suffocate under the weight of it all, the doors burst open with a resounding bang. The white rabbit bounded in, his pink eyes wide with excitement, his fur standing on end as if he'd been electrified. "Evidence! I have evidence!" he cried, his shrill voice cutting through the silence. In his paw, he brandished a letter like a knight wielding a sword, waving it about with such vigor that Alice feared he might take flight. The courtroom erupted into a flurry of whispers and gasps. Alice felt a spark of hope ignite within her chest as her keen eyes noticed details that others seemed to miss. The handwriting on the letter didn't match the knave's, and there was no signature at the bottom. It was like finding a glimmer of light in a dark cave. The king, however, seemed oblivious to these crucial details. He snatched the letter from the rabbit's paw, his face lighting up as if he'd just been handed the key to all of Wonderland's mysteries. "This is damning evidence indeed," he declared triumphantly, his voice dripping with self-satisfaction. Alice felt a surge of frustration rise within her. It was as if she could see the truth clearly, while everyone else was stumbling about in the dark. "But it proves nothing," she protested, her words cutting through the courtroom like a knife through butter. Undeterred, the king began to read the nonsensical verses aloud. His monotonous voice droned on, the words washing over Alice like waves on a shore. As he read, a strange sensation began to overtake her. It was as if she were expanding, growing taller and stronger with each passing second. She looked down at her hands in wonder, marveling at how small the cards seemed now. The fear that had been gnawing at her insides melted away, replaced by a surge of courage that burned bright and fierce within her. Without thinking, Alice interrupted the king mid-sentence. "This is absurd," she cried, her voice ringing out clear and strong, echoing off the walls of the courtroom. "You can't possibly find any meaning in those ridiculous verses." The queen's face turned a violent shade of red, her eyes bulging with rage. She looked like a volcano about to erupt. "Off with her head!" she shrieked, her voice cracking with fury, spittle flying from her lips. But Alice stood her ground, towering over the cards like a giant among ants. She felt invincible, untouchable, as if she'd finally found her place in this topsy-turvy world. With a boldness that surprised even herself, she declared, "You're nothing but a pack of cards." The courtroom erupted into chaos. The entire pack of cards rose into the air as if caught in a whirlwind, their edges glinting menacingly in the light. They swirled around Alice in a dizzying storm of red and black, their sharp corners threatening to slice her skin. Alice screamed, her arms flailing wildly as she tried to beat them off. The world spun around her in a kaleidoscope of color and motion, faster and faster, until she could no longer tell up from down. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing herself for impact, her heart racing so fast she thought it might burst from her chest. And then suddenly, everything was still. The chaos vanished as quickly as it had begun, leaving behind an eerie silence. Alice's eyes fluttered open, adjusting to the sudden change. She found herself lying on a soft, grassy bank, her head resting in her sister's lap. The warm sun caressed her face like a gentle hand, and a soft breeze rustled the leaves overhead, carrying with it the sweet scent of wildflowers. It had all been a dream. Excitement bubbled up inside her like a fountain, threatening to overflow. She turned to her sister, her eyes sparkling with wonder, and her cheeks flushed with the lingering thrill of her adventure. "Oh, you won't believe the adventure I've just had," she exclaimed, launching into a breathless retelling of her journey through Wonderland. Her words painted vivid pictures in the air, bringing to life the curious characters and fantastical landscapes of her dream. She spoke of the White Rabbit and his pocket watch, of the Mad Tea Party and the grinning Cheshire Cat. Her hands gestured wildly as she described the Queen's croquet game and the nail-biting trial. Her sister listened intently, a soft smile playing on her lips. As Alice's tale unfolded, her sister's imagination took flight, soaring through the whimsical world Alice had created. In her mind's eye, she saw Alice as a grown woman, her childlike spirit still burning bright. She imagined an older Alice, her eyes twinkling with mischief, sharing these magical tales with wide-eyed children gathered around her. As Alice's story came to an end, her sister felt a warmth spread through her chest. She knew that this dream, this wonderful, nonsensical adventure, would live on long after this moment. It would be a tale passed down through generations, keeping the magic of Wonderland alive in the hearts and minds of children for years to come. And as the sisters sat there, basking in the warm afternoon sun, the real world seemed to shimmer and shift around them. For a moment, it was as if the boundaries between reality and fantasy had blurred, and the magic of Wonderland had seeped into their own world, leaving it just a little bit curiouser than before.
This book was generated using Speakter's AI voices. You can create human-like voiceovers in over 50 languages.